I got one long Bigfoot story for you. It's a good one. It's a long one, but it's a good one. And it goes something like this here. This is a story I got maybe a couple of months ago, and the author doesn't want his name released. So I'm just going to start reading it to you. It's pretty long. I think it's going to take up one video. But again, I hope you enjoy this. It's really, really a good story. You guys are getting to be really good at writing these stories. So here's what the writer says. After listening to one of your recent interviews, I finally felt like I could share my encounter story for the first time. I don't want you to use my name, and I have changed the names of those involved. For those who live through this ordeal, it will all come flooding back as if it happened yesterday, because it can't be denied or ignored. For those who didn't live it, well, you'll just have to decide for yourself if you think it was real or not, because I really don't care what you believe. It doesn't change what me and so many others know. Back in the mid-1970s, I was 27 years old, married, and with 2 sons, living in a brand new, very small 900 square foot split entry home. This was a new development of cookie-cutter government-subsidized homes in the absolute middle of nowhere. These days, however, it is in the middle of thousands of homes and is a suburb of Salt Lake City, Utah. It was a beautiful, warm spring Sunday afternoon. The sky was blue without a cloud. I was taking a walk with my young son just to enjoy the day. As we passed a house of a very good friend of mine, I noticed several neighbors excitedly coming and going from his house. Naturally, I was curious as to what was up, so I poked my head in to see what all the hubbub was about. All these guys were fathers with young families to feed, and they were excited because the Division of Wildlife Resources of Utah had authorized a cow elk hunt in an area which supported a large elk population and had never been open for a cow elk hunt before. This hunt was to coincide with the regular season hunt for bull elk. The cow tags would be allowed by drawing for only an extra $10. The possibility of bringing home a couple of 100 pounds of elk meat for the low price of $25 was appealing, and a heck of a selling point to one's spouse as justification of the necessary hunting expedition and the expenses that would go with it. There were 600 tags available, and with the low number of hunters that hunted elk in those days and the remoteness of the area, odds seemed very good of being drawn on this hunt. Several guys were standing around the kitchen table examining a topographical map of the area. They were discussing various options of where and how to hunt the rugged and remote area. I had basically entered the room unnoticed, and as I looked at the map, I realized the area in question was an area that I had hunted for years and I was very familiar with it. I listened intently as they talked about possible camping and hunting spots. As the discussion progressed, it amused me somewhat of the oblivious lack of proper interpretation of the map. I finally piped up with the reasons why their developing plan was severely flawed. One guy asked how I knew that it was a bad plan. I told them that I'd been hunting that area for years. I was quickly brought up to speed on the change in the hunting regulations in that area for the upcoming hunting season, which, by the way, I was totally unaware of due to my extremely busy work schedule that year and not having had time to read the proclamation yet. Opening day of elk season was on the first Wednesday of the month of October every year. The week before opening day, we all traveled to the area, and I planned to show them around as best as I could. They would all be straggling in the next week and at different times, and I wanted them to be familiar with the area. The hunting area was a large high mountain valley wedged between 2 high cliffs, white in color and commonly referred to by those who hunted the area as the White Rocks. These cliffs were steep enough and tall enough as to prevent resident game animals from passing over the top and down into the next mountain drainage, except in a couple of places that allowed passage. My proposed campsite was right above the ravine where elk would pass through between the cliffs and down into the mountain drainages on the other side, especially when they were being pressured by hunters from below. Normally, I wasn't able to camp at that site because somebody else would always beat me to it. However, when we arrived the week almost 10 days before opening day, the camping area was empty. Normally, it would have been occupied by this time. The fact nobody was camped there gave me pause. I investigated the site and could see evidence that someone had made camp because there was a cord of firewood and 2 freshly dug fire pits. Upon further investigation of the site, I discovered a tent peg in the ground and part of a cord used to tie the tent down, which had been cut about 2 feet above the attachment site to the stake as if it had been cut by someone in a hurry. By the looks of it, a camp had been set up, but for some reason hastily torn down. We set up camp and then took those who were with me to the key choke points in the cliff barrier, and I instructed them where to position themselves to provide the best shot opportunities. If they were in position 45 minutes or so before daylight, they would most certainly get a shot at a cow elk. The plan was that I would push from below as I hunted my way up from the valley below to the top where they would lay in wait. Anything shot below the cliff barrier would be quartered and carried out to my vehicle in the bottom of the valley and then driven up and around to the camp. Upon returning home from the scouting expedition, I was informed of the passing of my grandfather, who was at the time 97 years old. He had passed the Friday night that we had left to go check out the hunting area. There were no cell phones in those days, so I didn't learn of his passing until late Sunday evening when I arrived home. This sad news was devastating to me. He was my favorite grandfather and my best friend, and I admired him greatly. My grandfather knew Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid personally, and I actually owned the dinner table passed down to me where the both of them sat and ate dinner with my grandfather and his parents and my great-grandparents. Funeral arrangements had been made for Tuesday, and I was designated to be a pallbearer and to give a short eulogy. This tragic event changed my plans for the hunt departure. I would have to leave for the hunt late Tuesday evening, arriving at my predestined hunt position, hopefully just in time to start hunting at dawn. It wasn't the 175-mile drive that was so time-consuming. It was the time-consuming drive up the treacherously rough mountain roads to the actual hunt site. This usually took an hour and a half in broad daylight and twice that in pitch black of night. If all went well, I would arrive in time and maybe get a couple hours of sleep. As luck would have it, I did make good time, and I had 2 hours of sleep before I had to get up and hunt. When 0 hour arrived, I was awakened by my alarm on my watch to a clear, crispy, cold pre-dawn morning. There was just faint light in the east above the cliff tops to the east of me, and the bull elk were already bugling all over the valley in front of me. It was a perfect day to hunt. I crept through the woods to the place that I would start my stalk. About 45 minutes into the hunt, I expected to hear gunshots ring out from the white rocks above as elk tried to sneak out of the valley and into the dark timber on the other side. I managed to sneak up on a herd of elk as the herd bull was occupied bugling and rounding up his cows. This was unusual at this time of year, but the cold snap had arrived late that season and the elk had not finished the rut. The wind was blowing down the hill in my favor, allowing me to crest a 7-foot deep crevasse in the earth to sneak right up to the outer edge of the elk herd. I couldn't see the elk, but based on the commotion, the mewing, and the bugling, I could tell that they were close. The wind swirled and began coming from below me, and right then it hit me. It was a dreadful stink that made me want to vomit. I actually started to gag, and I did everything I could to prevent making any noise as not to reveal my position and blow this incredible opportunity. I had a neck gaiter on, so I pulled it up over my nose and mouth, hoping that it would negate the awful stench. I regained control of my gag reflex, and I felt like I could continue the stalk. I looked up and saw a cow elk standing above me on the bank of the crevasse. She had her nose high in the air, assessing the smell in the air. Not mine, but the other stench that had caused me to gag. She was nervous and getting ready to bark her alarm, which would set the herd into a frenzy. It was now or never. I rushed up the slanted bank of the ravine I was concealed in to where my head and shoulders were above the bank, allowing a great shooting position. The cow bolted and barked her alarm. Quickly I scanned the chaotic scene as all hell broke loose. I quickly spotted a bull, and my single-shot Model 78 Browning 4570 octagon-barreled rifle roared. The bull dropped right in his tracks where he stood. The rest of the herd crashed down the hill from me, not in the direction I would have liked them to go since my hunting companions were uphill from me. I struggled out of the ravine to claim my prize, but had to take cover behind a large aspen tree as the same herd of elk came crashing back the way it had gone and darn near trampled me in the process. Something had frightened them so badly that they had changed course 180 degrees in the middle of a mass evacuation and made them run straight back towards the first danger to avoid the second. Now they were headed the direction that I wanted them to go, but what had turned them and what on this green earth was that stench that crawled into my nostrils, down my throat, and began to gag and choke me again. I heard it. It was coming. It was coming hard and fast, crashing through the trees and popping branches and sticks and limbs as it bulldozed its way towards me up the hill from below. Just before it came into view from below, it put the brakes on and stopped abruptly just out of my sight. This valley that I was hunting held the world record for the largest black bear ever killed in the lower 48 states, so I wasn't overly alarmed. I made the assumption that it must be a big old black bear. I then thought about this for a minute. I had not actually seen a black bear while hunting elk in this area ever. I'd seen sign, but never actually a real bear. Nevertheless, I reloaded my rifle and I prepared to defend myself if necessary. I heard more crashing and popping coming from the left flank as I faced downhill to the west. Crap, there were more of them and I was most likely surrounded by a bear. But by a bear? Really? I reached in and I gripped my 44 mag revolver in case one of them charged me. Just then I heard a familiar voice booming through the trees from the direction of that threat to my left. It was my old friend Lynn Hastings, the local government trapper in this area, yelling my name and trying to locate me. I was relieved. I holstered my handgun and I yelled back, giving him a fix on my location in the trees. A minute later, he emerged through the trees with his son, a mule, and 3 horses in tow. I watched the whole thing from the ridge over there through my binoculars, he said. Nice stalk on the elk herd. Let's get to dressing out that bull. Lynn and his son had helped me dress out game before. It was almost a tradition. He was always there. I asked Lynn what had turned those elk after I shot. He said, "You don't want to know." "Sure I do. Was it a bear?" I asked. "No, it was the old man of the mountain," he said. "Old man of the mountain? Like old timer that never takes a bath ever because he stinks?" I said. "Yeah, something like that," Lynn replied. Mark, Lynn's son, piped up and he said it was a Sasquatch. I was getting tired of being taken for a dummy and I said, "Seriously, guys, what was it?" Lynn looked me directly in the eye with a no bullcrap look. He said, "It was a Bigfoot, boy. It was a Bigfoot. He's lived here for years, and you had the distinct privilege of royally screwing up his hunt, for which I'm sure he is not happy." I didn't know what to think or say, so our conversation turned back to the task at hand, field dressing the bull elk. I realized there had been no shooting from the cliffs above. Had my friends above all fell asleep and missed the hunt opportunity of a lifetime? I asked Lynn if he had run into my friends at any point that morning, and he said that he had. He told me that he saw them leaving the area 2 hours before sunup. I asked if they had been leaving camp to hunt, and Lynn told me no, they were headed out of the area with all their gear. "Why would they do that?" I asked. "That is a question you're going to have to ask them," was Lynn's reply. After he finished with the elk, I started the hike to the top of the White Rocks to see what was going on. A bad storm was blowing in, and it was difficult to make the climb in all that wind. Finally, at our camp, and to my surprise, there was nothing there but my tent. As I surveyed the campsite in total disbelief, the music to the Twilight Zone started playing in my head. The campsite was empty except for my tent. I noticed a piece of paper pinned to my tent, but the biggest part of the note had been torn away, I assume by the wind, and it was the part that had all the writing on it. I had no choice but to hunker down in my tent and ride out the storm. I was literally right on top of the mountain, unprotected by anything save the rock ridge behind my tent that divided the two sides of the mountain. This was a nasty thunder and lightning storm with furious winds which sounded like freight trains roaring. They pelted my canvas tent with rain and hail. The lightning was getting closer. It was going to be right on top of me in no time, so I laid in my little two-man pup tent staring up at the top of the metal tent pole thinking, what a great lightning rod it makes, and wondering when lightning was going to strike it and cook me. The storm was fierce and showed no signs of stopping, making sleep impossible. I think it was about 3 a.m. and something pulled really hard on one of the support cords to my tent. It almost brought my tent down. By this time, the storm was subsiding, thank heavens, and I was curious to what it was. With my handgun strapped to my waist, I ventured out into the stormy night, carefully looking around to see what I could in the darkness. I didn't need a flashlight because the ambient light off the moon breaking through the now fragmented clouds above me gave me plenty of light to see. Behind me to the northwest, the storm raged on. Nothing moved around me, so I meandered around to the east through the saddle to the other side of the rock outcropping. I had to pee. About 15 yards directly in front of me was a small 8 or 9 foot pine tree growing in the rocky ground all by itself. It was a two-topped tree. I had passed this tree a couple of times and never noticed the two tops. I was good at spotting those because my grandfather and I had played games with each other, trying to spot more two-tops than the other could. In the low light, I noticed the tree seemed a lot more dense and full than it had in my memory, like it had filled out some. Just then, a gust of wind blew directly into my face from the direction of the lone pine. My blood ran cold. That horrible smell was back. My .44 Magnum was skinned faster than ever, and I stood there trying to clearly identify the target, but I couldn't in the dark of the night. Lightning flashed from behind me, illuminating the tree, and the creature standing behind it. I was frozen in my tracks, and then it registered in my mind. I had seen the monster in front of me, and all my attention was focused on him. The image that I had just seen when the lightning hit played through my memory once more. When the night was lit by the lightning behind me, there were two shadows in front of me. One was mine, the other was a much larger shadow cast from something standing right behind me. Thunder cracked. I almost jumped out of my skin. The creature in front of me turned and stepped out from behind the pine tree to squarely face me. I noticed that he was holding something with both hands. He was massively muscular and well-defined. We stood there sizing each other up. Finally, he snorted in a dismissive manner. He turned and lumbered away with what appeared to be a slight limp, traversing the open bowl area and into the dark timber on the other side. I stood there waiting for the one behind me to make its move on me. I didn't know what to do, so I just stood there listening to see if I could hear when it was going to come in for the kill. I waited, hoping that I would hear it, but it never moved. Lightning lit the sky behind me again, and the shadow was still there. I spun around, and it was gone. I was relieved, but I was still exposed. After a minute or two, I secured my weapon back into its holster. I turned and walked back to my tent in a surreal daze. Once in my tent, I was shaking uncontrollably. I would like to think it was because the cold and wet, but it wasn't that. It was because I was frightened out of my wits. I waited about 20 minutes, but I couldn't really control the tremors in my hands, and I sure as heck wasn't going to be able to go back to sleep. So I packed up my stuff and I tore down my tent, I rolled it up, and I lashed it to my day pack. It was still dark. It was way too dark to go back to Lynn's camp the way that I had come up, but I could walk down the road a ways and take another less treacherous way off the white rocks into the valley. This would be a much longer route, but it would be safer under the circumstances. The longer route put me in Lynn's camp right at daybreak. They were up and about, hollering back and forth to one another about something. I announced myself prior to entering the camp, a long-lost tradition these days, and I awaited a welcome and invite into their camp. They were surprised to see me that early and couldn't imagine how I'd come off the top in the dark. As I walked into the camp, I said, "I think I know why my friends abandoned camp in such a panicked rush." "Why is that?" said Lynn. "It's that old man of the mountain. He paid me a visit last night," I replied. Lynn said that the beast had paid them a visit too. He went on to explain that half of my elk had been taken. Lynn and Mark secured the rest of my elk to their pack horse, and we left. 2 hours later, we were back at my truck. We transferred the elk to my truck, and I reached to shake Lynn's hand. A loud roar echoed through the area. It was coming from the area that we had just left. Lynn said that that was that beast, and he was probably angry we had taken the other half of the meat. He was thinking the monster was going to tear up his camp, and he needed to get moving to try and salvage what he could. I asked if there was anything that I could do, and Lynn told me not to worry. He said that he had been dealing with these things for years and that old creature usually stayed clear. He mentioned that he had shot the thing once with a shotgun and it gave him a limp. Since that day, the beast had avoided Lynn, and when Lynn turned to get up on his horse, I slipped $400 in his saddlebag. There was no way that he was going to take that money from my hand. I had been saving that money for a new rifle, but Lynn had helped out so much, and he had probably lost a lot of his gear at camp. When I arrived home, I stopped at my friend's house to see what had happened. They weren't home, but his wife was, and I talked to her, and she said that one of the other guys had a medical emergency and that none of them felt right about hunting until they knew that he was going to be okay. I left there, and soon I was at one of the other guys' houses to see how he was doing. He wasn't there, and his wife had no idea what I was talking about. It was obvious then that nobody really wanted to talk about what had happened that night, so I decided to leave it alone. Time passed, nothing was said, and everyone moved on. For 35 years since then, I have worked in the medical healthcare profession. 20 years into my career, I bumped into one of the guys that had been on that trip with us. In the course of our catch-up conversation, the subject of that hunt arose. He confessed that there was no real medical emergency other than one guy had thought that he was having a heart attack after their camp had been attacked early in the morning by an unidentifiable creature. Turns out that he was experiencing severe anxiety or a panic attack as a result of the confrontation. Most thought it must have been a bear that he encountered, but he insisted that it was something else, something much more cunning and sinister. He claims that it was a Bigfoot. He swears to it till this day. I told the man across from that table from me that it was a Bigfoot and that the man had been telling the truth all along. Mr. Anonymous, wonderful story, great story, and I really appreciate you sending it. It was real exciting, and I know everyone enjoyed it. Thank you all for listening to this video. I really appreciate you, and we will see you on the next one. Thanks.